There are two very, very big news stories dominating the world media today. One is the ongoing situation in Ukraine, which will be the main topic of this program. The other is the indictment of Donald Trump, which has now taken place. And this is a topic which I'm going to discuss fully in a live stream on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and also, of course, with Robert Barnes, who is a practicing American lawyer, is somebody who is especially expert to discuss this topic. So I'm not going to discuss the Donald Trump issue today. What I propose to do today is to discuss the military situation in Ukraine, certain diplomatic overtures that the Zelensky government may be making, and I really want to stress the word may be making, and also briefly touch on Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen's trips, separate trips, even though they're going there at the same time, to Beijing. Let's talk about the military situation in Ukraine first. And here we are now getting a cascade of news suggesting that the Ukrainians were forced, admitting by the Ukrainians that they were forced to pull out of the center of Bakhmut because of the very real risk that if their troops had been left there, they would have been trapped there. And there is now growing talk that the Ukrainians have finally decided that they're going to try and extract their troops from Bakhmut. They're going to finally pull out. They've now accepted that Bakhmut is irretrievably lost and that the chances of continuing to cling on to Bakhmut have now essentially gone. And there's been a comment about this from President Zelensky himself. And this was said at a news conference by Zelensky in Poland, where he is currently on a state visit. He said this with President Duda of Poland by his side. He said, "We maintain presence in Bakhmut. General Syrski is in charge of the operational situation there. If there's a point that the situation gets even hotter, a threat arises that troops will be lost due to an encirclement, then certainly there will be relevant, appropriate decisions by the general at the scene." Now, note that Zelensky is not saying here that the Ukrainians are definitely going to pull out from Bakhmut. He's saying that will only happen if there's a danger that they might get encircled. And note also that he's throwing the entire weight of the decision upon General Syrski. He's been making it very clear for weeks, months, that he wants Ukrainian troops to hold out till the end, to the bitter end in Bakhmut. But he's now saying that if General Syrski decides that the troops should be pulled out, then he's not going to stand in the way. Now, given how strong a position he's historically taken over Bakhmut, I have to say I feel that is something of an abdication of responsibility. If it is indeed the Ukrainian intention to pull troops out of Bakhmut, then I think President Zelensky, properly speaking, should go back to Kiev, go on national television, he does so regularly anyway, make an address to the Ukrainian people, formally tell them that Ukraine has to pull its troops out of Bakhmut because the situation for those troops has now become unbearable, and take that responsibility himself and make it clear that it is his decision. He should also, of course, thank the troops for their sacrifice. Whether he will do any of these things, in light of this comment, it seems to me now looks unlikely. But there we are. First hint from Zelensky, first real hint from Zelensky, that Ukrainian troops may have to pull out from Bakhmut, though he's doing it in a way that anybody in Ukraine who is unhappy with that decision, well, they're being in effect invited to blame General Syrski. I do wonder, by the way, whether General Syrski's position might fairly soon come under challenge. In the meantime, another Ukrainian general, a retired Ukrainian general, General Kriponos, who has made some rather negative comments about the Ukrainian military's conduct of the war, has now given an interview in which he says that, in his opinion, Bakhmut should have been evacuated back in February. There was no military logic in clinging on to Bakhmut beyond February, and he essentially criticizes Zelensky and the Ukrainian military leadership for engaging in what you might call meat grinder tactics. Meat grinder tactics in which General Kriponos says it's the Ukrainians who have lost their best troops, whilst the Russians have preserved theirs. So there might be a row in Ukraine over any pullback from Bakhmut, and of course it hasn't yet happened. Now, I should say that multiplicity of reports from both sides is now saying that fighting in Bakhmut has intensified, that the Wagner organization is pushing hard towards the Ukrainians in the western part of Bakhmut. It's also continuing with its offensive in Bogdanovka, where allegedly it's actually managed to establish a physical presence in the village, in other words, capture a part of the village. It's also suggesting that there's also reports that the Russians are now pushing hard on Orekhovo, Vasilievka, and that they're still fighting for Ivanivskaya and Khromovo. So all sorts of fighting continues to go on in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut will have to undertake a fighting retreat, never an easy thing to do. And if they're going to escape, they're going to have to escape through a narrow funnel, one which is going to be, however, one which is being shelled by Russian artillery. Against that, if they stay in Bakhmut, I'm told that the area that they still control inside Bakhmut has no more than a circumference of around 5 kilometers. So it's now very small. The Russians can concentrate artillery upon this small area. It would be reckless, suicidal to try to cling on. Of course, there is a third option, which is that they might decide to try to negotiate the terms of their withdrawal from the Russians. Perhaps they might even lay down their arms. But to be frank, I don't think that's going to happen. So realistically, they either fight on to the last and get killed or wounded or captured by the Russians, or what I'm starting to think is most likely to happen, they will try to pull back with Zelensky blaming General Syrski for the fact that this has happened. So that's what I want to say about the situation in Bakhmut today. There has been more news from other battle fronts. It seems that the Russians are still incrementally pushing around Avdiivka, though, as I said, I think the weight of the battle for the Russians has, over the last couple of days, been on clearing up, finally ending this long battle in Bakhmut itself. Any plans the Russians might have had for a grander encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut has clearly been abandoned. I suspect that those large Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived in Bakhmut or near Bakhmut 3 weeks ago probably convinced the Russian command that this was perhaps an unattainable thing, and that the Russians want to sort out the issue of Bakhmut before the Ukrainians begin their offensive, which could happen, of course, at any time. We'll come to that in a moment. But there's been some more interesting news from Vuhledar and Marinka. First of all, the Russians claim again that they're making more advances in Marinka. Well, they've been saying this for weeks now, and it is very difficult to get an accurate picture of what's going on in Marinka. I'm not going to debate it in any further detail. But there was some interesting and rather tantalizing news from Vuhledar. The first is that it seems to me that Russian aircraft, aviation, Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers are now operating around Vuhledar, and they're launching these precision-guided bombs on Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar. I've discussed many times that the Russians have been, that the most effective way to break defenses is to bomb them rather than to shell them. The fact that the Russians haven't been able to bomb Ukrainian defenses because of the potency of Ukraine's legacy era air defense system has been perhaps the single most important factor in slowing down this entire operation. It's now, I think, quite clear that the key priority of the attacks, the missile attacks on Ukraine's energy system, was to force Ukraine to expend air defense missiles, defending something, Ukraine's energy system, which Ukraine had no option but to defend, depleting the number of missiles in that system, causing the missile launchers to reveal themselves, opening themselves up thereby to attack by the Russian Air Force. And it seems that the Russians now sense that the air defense system, the Ukrainian air defense system, is now so depleted, or is sufficiently depleted, that they can risk carrying out airstrikes with high altitude bombers upon Ukrainian positions using these glided bombs. And it looks as if they're starting to do that in Vuhledar itself. And I've also seen a report that Russian air defense troops are now starting to position themselves close to Vuhledar, which is interesting because it seems as if the Russians may be anticipating some kind of counterstrike by the Ukrainian Air Force. But anyway, they're bringing their own air defense troops closer to Vuhledar, presumably in anticipation of a Russian attack on the town, another Russian attack on the town, one which will be perhaps supported by these bombers, and one which, through the deployment of air defense assets, is intended to close the airspace around Vuhledar to any Ukrainian aircraft. Now, I say that a couple of days ago, Ukraine was claiming that it was in possession of 72 MiG-29s, largely donated by Poland and Slovakia. I was a little skeptical about that report. It seems the skepticism might have been justified. Poland has just announced on the occasion of Zelensky's visit to Poland that Poland is donating another 4 MiG-29s to Ukraine. It's quite clear to me that only a fraction of these fighter jets have actually arrived in Ukraine up to this time. And anyway, we will see what happens. But the fact that the Russians are, as I said, forward deploying air defense assets does suggest that they are being wary about possible strikes by the Ukrainian Air Force. And bear in mind that there's confirmation that the United States has supplied JDAM bombs to Ukraine and has attempted to integrate them. These are gliding bombs, precision-guided gliding bombs to Ukraine, has attempted to integrate them with these MiG-29 fighters. And the point is, and I said this in an earlier program, that the Russians possess extremely potent air defense assets, and fighter jets, MiG-29s, trying to launch JDAM bombs are at serious risk of being shot down by this Russian air defense system. And I suspect it's partly to prevent attacks by MiG-29s with JDAMs that the Russians are forward deploying air defense assets near Vuhledar, if of course they actually are, and if that report is indeed correct. I would point out that the latest versions of the Buk air defense missile system, operated both by Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine operates a version of the Buk missile system that was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and deployed in the 1980s, whereas modern versions of the Buk system operated by Russia are very different indeed. They are much, much more powerful. Russian versions of the Buk missile system can certainly intercept aircraft at the kind of distances and the sort of altitudes that would be needed in order to prevent them launching JDAM bombs. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the battlefronts. It does look as if, as I said, the battle for Bakhmut is indeed now at the very end of its end game, and we will probably see the entire town pass under Russian control within the next few days. Now, I mentioned Zelensky's comments about a possible pullback from Bakhmut, very, as I said, qualified comments. There's been a big report in the Financial Times which reads, Ukraine ready to talk to Russia on Crimea if counteroffensive succeeds. And we are told that andreevka, deputy head of the Zelensky's office, in other words, someone close to Zelensky, has said this: it will be, if we succeed in achieving our strategic goals on the battlefield, and when we will be on the administrative border with Crimea, we are ready to open a diplomatic page to discuss this issue. It doesn't mean that we exclude the way of liberation by our army. Now, some are interpreting this as a sign that Zelensky is prepared to recognize the loss of Crimea. I have to say that is not my impression. My own impression is that what Zelensky, through his officials, are saying is the same thing that many Ukrainian officials have already been saying. If, and it is an important if, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful, if they break through to Crimea's administrative borders, then they're prepared to sit down with the Russians and get the Russians to agree to hand over Crimea to them. If that doesn't happen, then Ukraine will leaves itself open the option of marching on to Crimea. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is any of these are realistic scenarios. I'm simply saying that Ukraine has said this before. I don't think that Sybiga is saying anything different from comments that Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky himself, by the way, have made in the past. So I just want to put that on record, because there was a flurry of reports yesterday that Ukraine might be prepared to give up Crimea, or rather recognize the loss of Crimea and resume negotiations with the Russians. To be totally frank, I just don't see that in these comments. It's something which the Ukrainians might eventually be forced to do, but I don't see that that's what these comments say at all. And I just want to put that on record. Anyway, what about the Ukrainian counter-offensive? Well, the United States published another big arms package yesterday. I'm going to leave it to Brian Belletti to take it apart. I didn't see anything there that could possibly be of material use in this counteroffensive. It seems to me that Ukraine has all the weapons from the West that it's going to get before this counteroffensive takes place. And there's been more and more reports, more and more admissions that this number of equipment might not be enough. Of course, others are saying otherwise. There are reports that the Pentagon thinks that the amount of equipment supplied to Ukraine is perfectly adequate for the purpose of this offensive. Now, the Russians say, Yan Gagin, Denis Pushilin's advisor. Denis Pushilin is, of course, the head of the Donetsk regional government. Anyway, the Russians say that they have built up layered defenses. Gagin said that in many places in Donbass, in Kremenna, Svatovo area, in Zaporozhye, these defenses are 4 layers deep. They do seem to be very heavily fortified indeed. It might be optimistic to think that Ukraine has enough heavy equipment to succeed in this offensive. But, I'm not a military person. Who knows? The general consensus appears to suggest otherwise. But, you'll just have to wait and see. There's also, as I said, been concerns expressed most recently in a long article in the New York Times that Ukrainian soldiers have been very hurriedly trained, that they don't have the morale they once did. Even with this equipment, they may not be up to the job of carrying out an offensive. And given the losses that they've experienced over the course of the war, specifically the losses they've experienced in Bakhmut, but also in so many other places, it'd be unsurprising, actually, if some of them don't particularly want to be thrown into what might easily turn out to be another meat grinder. But having said all of this, I want to make it absolutely clear, I am no doubt at all that this offensive, whenever it happens, will indeed happen. I've had doubts about Ukrainian offensives before. I was skeptical. I became increasingly skeptical over the course of last August as to whether Ukraine would launch an offensive in Kherson region, for example. I gained the impression that the Ukrainian military were deeply unenthusiastic about the idea. The General Zaluzhny seemed to think it would be a mistake and would result in a diversion and depletion of Ukrainian forces. But the United States and Britain insisted upon it, and therefore it happened. And I'm afraid the same is true now. Whether or not this Ukrainian offensive, wherever it is that it's going to happen, is a good idea or not, it comes up against the fact that the United States and Britain insist upon it happening. And on the principle that he who pays the piper calls the tune, the United States, which provides all the funding now that's keeping Ukraine afloat, either directly or through its friends at the International Monetary Fund, and which provides the vast bulk of the military equipment that Ukraine is using, and which, in addition to that, has pervasive influence in Kiev itself, with various people in the Ukrainian political system deeply attached to the United States. Well, the United States is going to insist on this offensive, and Ukraine has no option but to carry it out, whatever doubts about this offensive it might have. And note that Civica, in these comments reported by the Financial Times, in effect confirms that there is going to be an offensive, though his words, if we will succeed in achieving our strategic goals on the battlefield, the word if suggests doubts about its prospects. Well, we will see what happens. Now, as to when this offensive is going to happen, I don't know. As I said, there's been constant reports from all kinds of Russian sources that it might be happening today, tomorrow, next week, next month. We shall see. It could be happening, could have started by the time you are watching this program. If it is, I'm afraid, I apologize, but we'll have to deal with it in the program that follows. I can only do what I can. But anyway, the essential point is that it will probably be there will be an offensive. I don't know when. I don't know whether Ukraine, I don't know what, even whatever doubts about it there may be. The Russians say they are ready. They're ready to meet it. And as I said, anybody who has any doubts about that should put them aside. Now, I'm going to finish this video. It's going to be, as I said, one of the shorter videos that I'm going to be doing from now on, by discussing Macron's and Ursula von der Leyen's visit to to China. And there's been a succession of articles in the Western media, in Le Figaro, in The Guardian, in the Financial Times, all sorts of places, about Macron coming to Beijing to try to persuade China to change its stance over the Ukraine war, to switch sides in effect, to back the Western powers, to start putting pressure on the Russians to basically capitulate to Western demands on the question of the war. Now, I don't know what Macron intends to do, but there's been already an editorial in Global Times which straightforwardly warns him against trying to do any such thing. And I'm going to read part of what it says. And the warning in it. And it goes on to say that some Western media intentionally praised von der Leyen while criticising Macron, claiming that the former, who delivered a tough speech on China before her trip, is braver than Macron, who almost seems to be naive. The claim of Europe being naive about China has thus taken on a new version. A more complex and negative public opinion environment towards China is testing the strategic determination and political wisdom of European leaders. However, who is really naive is actually self-evident. Behind the public opinion lies a confusing and outdated perception of China that is severely out of touch with the times. Some Westerners cannot let go of the superiority complex derived from modern history, but have a sense of loss and lack confidence brought about by the new era. Therefore, they are eager to show a tough stance when facing China, afraid of being considered as weak. However, this deliberate, tough stance exposes the core of a mentality of the weak. Some European media are clamoring to harshly criticize or warn China on the Ukraine issue, which has allegedly failed to put itself in the right position. The true political courage should be reflected in not catering to, but overcoming such irrational social sentiments. Now, it's a very interesting editorial, and I have absolutely no doubt at all that it has been authorized, in this case, by the Chinese leadership, and that it's intended as a warning to Macron. Now, here, the Chinese are in effect warning Macron on the advance of his talks with Xi Jinping, which, by the way, have actually begun. Firstly, they are clearly unhappy with Ursula von der Leyen's comments about China, the ones that she made back in Brussels. As we know, she's now applying for a job as NATO Secretary General, so she wants to appear tough. And anyway, I suspect that her predisposition is to appear tough on China and on everything else. So the Chinese are unhappy with Ursula von der Leyen's comments, and they're effectively saying as much in this editorial. But they're saying this to Macron: look, we are going to receive you with all the pomp and circumstances of a visit by a head of state. We welcome you as a potential partner. We welcome you as a potential threat. But don't make the mistake of trying to threaten or warn us on our relations with the Russians, on the topic of Ukraine, or indeed on any other matter. If you do, if you really think that you can pressure us to change our policies on any of these important issues, you are being naive. You are not just being naive, you are being weak also, because we realize, we are well aware of the fact that deep down you don't agree with these tough stance policies that the United States, backed by its media supporters in Europe, are trying to push you into. True courage, true strength of the kind that we in China will respect, is not to be found in appeasing these belligerent voices in the West, voices which want confrontation with China and which have already led you into a disastrous confrontation with Russia. True courage, true wisdom, true strength is in facing down this kind of pressure, is in coming forward and making it clear that the dialogue between the EU, between Europe and China, must be maintained in the interests of all, and of course, in this particular case, in the interests of France, and telling all of those people who utter those criticisms basically to take a running jump and go away. So that's what the Chinese are telling Macron. And they're basically telling him, if he comes along and he starts warning and criticizing the Chinese, trying to persuade them to change their policies on an issue like Ukraine and on Russia, where the Chinese have gone out of their way to make their positions entirely clear, he will get nowhere. He will get no help, support, or sympathy from the Chinese. All that he will do is lose their respect. Of course, they will continue, as they always do, to receive him with great courtesy. They will utter the usual words, gracious words about cooperation and friendship and building bridges and things of that kind, so typical of Chinese diplomacy. But in fact and in practice, if Macron acts in that kind of way, as far as the Chinese are concerned, he will have lost face. He will have lost respect. They will see him as another stooge of the United States and of the Atlanticists in Europe. Now, I don't know whether Macron understands that. I don't know to what extent Macron and his entourage read the Chinese media, though I think it's inconceivable that they're not familiar with Global Times and that they don't scan what is said in the editorials there. But one way or the other, that's the Chinese warning, and he would be well advised to heed it. I am afraid that he won't. I think that Western leaders, European leaders, whatever their private doubts, are so worried now of crossing the Atlanticists, the neocons, that they're far more afraid of that than they are afraid of losing the respect of the Chinese. They probably calculate that they can afford to lose China's respect, but they can't afford to enrage the neocons. Having said that, Macron has been ambitious for himself and for France, and indeed for the EU as well. His presidency is in severe crisis in France itself. This would be last opportunity for him to shine. He's been planning this trip to Beijing for some time, apparently. Last time he was there was apparently in 2019. So he hasn't been there for a long time. If he wants to achieve anything, perhaps it would be wise for him to take heed of these Chinese warnings. Anyway, as I said, these are going to be shorter videos because, as I said, I'm about to start travelling to Kent, where I'm going to be going, out of London, where I'm going to be going for the next couple of days. And this is where I'm going to finish. As I said, a shorter video today, and so will my future ones be. So thank you again for joining me. Can I just also say that remind you that you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also go to our shop, check out our shop, and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, and please remember to tick the like button and also check your subscription to this channel. That's enough from me. More from me soon, and have a very good day.